I'd like to acknowledge the funders of Cochrane Canada, without whom these webinars, our training, systematic reviews, and capacity building could not happen. So thank you to CIHR and also to the Ontario Ministry of Health for their support. I'd also like to thank PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, for kindly providing the software for our webinars. And a special thank you to Luis Gabriel Cuervo, who produces the videos of our webinars that are located in the Canadian Cochrane Centre's webinar archives. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's webinar on school-based activity programs for children and adolescents aged 6 to 18, Evidence and Implications for Public Health, presented by Maureen Dobbins. Maureen Dobbins is a professor in the School of Nursing at McMaster University. Her research efforts seek to understand knowledge translation and exchange among public health decision makers in Canada. Her program of research has identified barriers and facilitators to research use, explored the information needs of public health decision makers, and developed, implemented, and evaluated a variety of knowledge translation strategies for public health decision makers. Since 2001, she has been the Scientific Director of Health Evidence, a single source of high-quality effectiveness evidence and one component of a comprehensive knowledge translation strategy for public health decision makers worldwide. On January 1st, 2012, Maureen also assumed the role of Scientific Director for the National Collaborating Centre for Methods and Tools, one of 6 national collaborating centres for public health in Canada. Thank you for being with us today, Maureen, and I'll turn the webinar over to you.
Oh, there we go. Thanks very much, Eileen. It's Maureen Dobbins here. I just had a little glitch there for a moment waiting for the microphone icon to come up. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to conduct this webinar today on this Cochrane review, which was actually an update of a previous review. And also thanks very much to the Canadian Cochrane Centre for collaborating with us on this webinar today, as well. I just also want to recognize another funding partner, which is Knowledge Translation Canada, who is funding a small project that we're doing where we're conducting a number of webinars on various Cochrane reviews, and then doing some evaluation of different ways in which we're going to present that evidence to folks across Canada. So I just want to show you what the team looks like. This is the Health Evidence team, made up of a group of managing director, and then Heather, that's who's Kara, DeCorby. Heather Husson is the manager of Health Evidence and looks after that. We have 2, Robin Trainer, who's a research coordinator, Lori Greco, who's a knowledge broker, and then we also have additional research assistants, as you can see at the bottom of your screen, and students who work with us as well. So thank you. It's a whole team effort that brings these webinars to life. So just a little bit about Health Evidence, if there are some folks on the line today that haven't heard of us before. But Health Evidence is a repository of, as Eileen said, of primarily systematic reviews that evaluate the effectiveness of public health interventions. And the main thinking behind the creation of this resource was that by making this evidence more easily accessible to public health decision makers, that would then lead to evidence-informed public health across the country and, in fact, worldwide. a little bit about, more about why we created health evidence. Really, it's about saving busy practitioners' time. We know that a significant barrier to using evidence is the time it takes to actually find the literature. And that issue is even more compounded in the public health world because looking for reviews of effectiveness in public health really is like looking for a needle in a haystack. There's a much smaller amount of that evidence in the large databases, and therefore it's even more difficult to find it. So we've done that work. We've scanned multiple databases looking for published reviews of effectiveness and putting all of those in one place as it relates to public health. And so everything in health evidence will be relevant to public health, and we try to be as current as possible. So at any given day, if you are on the site, we'll be no more than a few months behind what is currently published. So at any given point, no matter what topic, at most you might be missing 1 to 2 reviews, if any at all. We try to be extremely transparent in our process. So if you come onto the site, you can read about every step and every part of the process, from how we search for the evidence to how we decide what is relevant, to how we appraise the evidence for quality, to how we keyword it. Every step of the process has been clearly articulated and is available for you to learn about and also to provide feedback as well. We also know, because we've been very involved in wanting to know, does this in fact help public health engage in evidence-informed decision-making? And so we've been doing evaluation research along the way for many years now. And we know that just having access to the evidence, while an important component of EIDM, as we call it, evidence-informed decision-making, it's only one part of the issue. We know that there are many other components that support evidence-informed decision-making, tools, for example, resources. And so on the site, you will also be able to find some of those resources that we have created in collaboration in our work with public health departments. So as we've learned from others what types of supports are helpful to them, we've created those tools, and we make those available for you to download and use and change and modify, and also let us know if you do that, so that we can then make those changes available for others for whom that might be useful. And at the end of the day, we try to make sure that all of this is easy to use. So certainly we know that if it's complicated or takes too much time, then why would anyone use it? That's not our intent. So we try to make sure that it's intuitive, easy to use. For those of you that are familiar with health evidence, you'll know that we relaunched a completely redesigned site back in April. And we put a lot of work into making sure that the site was easier to use and more intuitive. And certainly the feedback we've been hearing since April is that we've done a good job in making it easier. But certainly I would be very happy to hear your thoughts and comments if you take a look at it. And we always try to address on a yearly basis any suggestions for improvement. So I welcome those. What you have up in front of you right now is what really guides us in our thinking of what is evidence-informed decision-making. And this is a model that's been modified by the National Collaborating Centre for Methods and Tools. This was modified from a previously existing model that was more specific for use by physicians, created by Dr. Brian Haynes here at McMaster. But what this model really depicts is that complex interactions between many different ways of knowing, all the different types of information that goes into public health decision making. And health evidence is really just contributing to that purple oval in the bottom left, which is the research side. So certainly it's one component, it's an important component, but it really is one component, and that really to achieve evidence-informed decision-making, we need good and the best available evidence that comes from community contacts and the local issues, community health issues, the community and political preferences, the public health resources that are available, and all of that knowledge is brought together with our public health expertise. And so that public health practitioner and decision maker is gathering information or evidence from all of these ovals and then using their expertise to pull all of this together to make the best decision for a particular setting or region or province, for example. What it allows us to consider is that even using the same evidence, so for example, the Cochrane Review that we'll talk about today, different decisions might be made about what to do around school-based interventions depending on the context that you are situated in. So what might be the right decision here in Hamilton, where we are located, might not be the same decision that others might take because the information from these other ovals is different. And so that's one of the reasons why this is, while there are many, many models of knowledge translation and exchange and evidence-informed decision-making, why this one speaks so much to me about what we're really faced with in public health in Canada. So if we just move forward now to the next slide, just a little bit about, what is that process of evidence-informed decision-making? And it really starts with cultivating a culture of critical thinking and inquiring. So wanting every public health practitioner across the country at all levels of the public health sector to be questioning why we do what we do. So not just accepting that this is the way we've always done it, but always thinking, how do I know that what we're doing is the achieving our intended goal? And even if we did look at the literature 2-3 years ago, has anything new emerged that might change our thinking at all about how we're delivering our services? So it starts with a culture of inquiry, and then moves into, well, how do we actually take a practice-based issue and turn that into a focused and searchable question? And this is very interesting. Whenever I am interacting with public health professionals and have them engage in this exercise of taking an issue that they see in their local area and then turning that into a focused question, that actually takes a lot more effort than one might think that it will. And usually what it creates is really good discussion that a team needs to be having in order to achieve this focused question. Because what we've learned along the way is that everyone in a particular team, most people will be having a different idea about what the most important outcome is, or what the issue really is, or who the population is that's let's say most at risk. So generating these conversations is really, really important, an important step in evidence-informed decision making. Then we want to search for the best available evidence, but we also want to make sure that we're conducting an efficient search so that we're not using up too much time to access. Then we need to know that we're using, being influenced by the best available evidence. So if we aren't accessing evidence that's already been critically appraised for us, as it would be in healthevidence.org, then we need to do that critical appraisal ourselves. And when we move on to the next slide, we're just finishing there with, once we've done this a critical appraisal, we need to think about what does all this research tell us? What are the findings? And now how do I integrate this into what I know to be the reality in my particular setting? And if we've then made a decision to change practice, then how do we go about implementing that? How do I make sure that everyone, every public health nurse or public health inspector or nutritionist or dietitian, all the professionals, how do I make sure they're actually implementing this new intervention or this change to the intervention? And then finally, we want to know that that this change is actually leading to a change in both practice and eventually population health outcomes. And then the final component there is how do we then promote exchange of knowledge amongst other public health decision makers across the country? Because one thing we have learned over the years is that from coast to coast to coast, a lot of the same issues are being addressed by health departments and looking at the same literature. And so a lot of effort going on in individual health departments that perhaps if we could get some more dialogue going on, there could be more sharing of these resources as we learn what works in the literature. So today's webinar is all about the school-based physical activity programs for promoting physical activity and fitness in children and adolescents. This review was first published in the Cochrane Library back in 2009, and then the update was published earlier this year in February. And quite amazingly so, between 2009 and the latter part of 2012, many studies worldwide continue to be published on this particular topic. And I'm sure, although I'm really not ready to start thinking about it, it really is time to start thinking about the update, because I know that the studies are continuing to be published. So why was this review done to begin with? What is so important? So we know that physical inactivity is a major issue in Canada as well as globally. It's the fourth leading risk factor for global mortality as determined by the WHO. We know that 1 in 4 Canadian children and youth are either overweight or obese. And we know that schools are really a really good place where we can access almost all children and many adolescents to help support healthy behaviors that hopefully will last a lifetime. So I want to start with a polling question and just ask first, who has heard of PICO? So when I frame that, even if I know that might be a little vague, but if we just say, what is a PICO question, you can say yes or no if you've heard of that. And just as you are inputting your data on that, what we'll be bringing up in a moment is what the PICO question was for this review. So I see here about 30% of you have said no, you do not, and about 16% have said yes. I think I'm reading that correctly there. Okay, so let's talk about what a PICO is. Really a way to think about how to frame our question. And this is something that we really get from the world of librarians in terms of what are the types of components of a question that you can put together to help you search for the evidence more effectively. It also helps us clarify what it is we want and what we're looking for. So PICO starts with, and this would be for questions around the effectiveness of an intervention or whether or not there is an association between a risk factor and a health outcome. But we would start with P being the population. So who is it that we are really interested in knowing something about? In this instance, with our school-based review, it was all children, but a more focused question might have focused on a certain, it could have been a certain ethnicity that we were particularly interested in, for example. So we want to be as clear and specific as possible about our population, and then we want to know what intervention or interventions we really want to know about. So it's important to specify those. You also want to identify, well, what are you comparing those interventions to? Is it the standard care, or is it some other intervention that's currently being implemented? And then we also want to be very clear and specific about what outcomes we're looking for. So it could be, you might want to start with, well, it's anything that's out there, but that could be a very long list, and so then you might want to focus in on something very specific. And then we also can add the setting. So are there particular settings that we are more interested in learning about than others? We can also use a slightly different variation of PICO to help us identify the qualitative literature. And in those instances, we would look at a PS model, which is identifying the population as well as the situation. So if we just move to the next slide, what we see is what the PICO was for our review on school-based physical activity. So our P here, our population, are children and adolescents aged 6 to 18 years. And generally this includes then children in most areas of the world that are grade 1 to grade 12-ish. The intervention are strategies focused on the promotion of physical activity and fitness, including educational, health promotion, counseling, and management strategies that occur in the school. We're comparing this to whatever standard educational programs already existed in the schools. And the primary outcomes were, if we categorize them, behavioral, which were television viewing, physical activity rates, physical activity duration, and then our secondary outcomes were more the physical health status measures, such as blood pressure, cholesterol, body mass index, maximal oxygen consumption, as well as pulse rate. You'll see on the very bottom of the slide now there's something called quality rating 10 strong. So what we do at healthevidence.ca is .org is that we assess all of the reviews in the registry for methodological quality, and that is a rating out of 10, 10 being the best possible rating. And you can see here that when we applied our quality criteria to this review, it received a rating of 10. So considered to be itself a strong review. So let's look at what the overall considerations are. Sorry, my screen went blank there for a moment, so my heart rate will go back down now in a moment. Anyway, this review was based on 44 randomized controlled trials. And it's important to note that while this review is considered to be a well-done systematic review, the studies within this review there are issues around the amount of bias, the risk of bias that's inherent in the individual studies. The interventions range the duration from 12 weeks to 6 years with quite a variety of intensity of those interventions. But overall, what the review found was school-based physical activity interventions had positive effects on the duration of moderate to vigorous physical activity. What was new in this update was some evidence that we could increase the proportion of children that were engaged in MVPA, that there was a reduction in television viewing, and also an improvement in VO2 max. So that's the really good news that we're excited about. However, there was no effect. And no effect meaning when you look at the entirety of the evidence, and I'll be showing you this in more detail in a moment, when you look at the entirety of the evidence, there was really no impact on those, all but one of the physical health status measures. So systolic blood pressure, cholesterol, BMI, pulse rate, there was no statistically significant impact in those outcomes. A review like this is really complicated and challenging because there were, across the 44 studies, there were no two interventions that were exactly the same. So the components of the school-based interventions were very different from study to study to study. So then it's really hard to know, well, amongst where we did see positive results, what I looked for are commonalities in the types of components that were always there when positive results were observed. And so what really came out fairly clear is that printed educational materials plus changes to the school curriculum that supported children being more active during the school day, those two strategies seem to be key when we see statistically significant findings in duration of MVPA, the physical activity rates, television viewing, and VO2 max. So just to talk a little bit more about the outcomes and what, really how much evidence there is. So with our behavioral outcomes, we had ended up having 5 studies that assessed physical activity rates. 23 of the 44 studies assessed duration of physical activity, and that's measured at the moderate to vigorous physical activity. 17 studies assessed time spent watching television. And then you can see down below, 16 studies measured blood pressure, both systolic and diastolic. 10 studies assessed cholesterol. 32 of the 44 assessed body mass index. 6 looked at maximal oxygen consumption, and then 6 looked at pulse rate. So one of the things that is interesting, and I noted this in the original review, was in all of these studies, the primary focus was the promotion of physical activity, and yet relatively few of the studies are actually measuring physical activity rates. So while we increased a little bit the number of studies looking at physical activity, one might question why there aren't more studies out of the 44 that are, in addition to other measures, ensuring that they're actually seeing an increase in physical activity and potentially as well, and looking for how long children are being physically active. You kind of wonder if those things, you need to make sure that's happening before one would bother looking to see whether or not you're seeing a change in the physical health status measures. But that's just, that's something that I reflect on in the discussion of the paper. So let's look a little bit more closely at our outcomes here. So we're starting with our behavioral outcomes, and we're starting with physical activity rates. So the first thing really to point out here is, again, there's rather limited evidence. However, this is worth noting because in the original review back in 2009, we really didn't have any studies that showed any impact on physical activity rates. And what we did see in the update is that 2 of 5 studies did see statistically significant increases in physical activity rates just among grade school children. One of the studies only provided a p-value, did not provide any effect sizes, but one of the studies actually shows, as is listed here, a fairly important increase in physical activity rate. So here we see an odds ratio of 2.74 and a 95% confidence interval that ranges from 2 to 3.75. So if I just, put that into words, what we see here is those exposed to, amongst children exposed to the school-based interventions, they were almost 3 times more likely to be physically active, to be engaging in MVPA, than children not exposed to the school-based intervention. And the 95% confidence interval tells us that that range goes from 2 times more likely to just shy of 4 times more likely. And so while the evidence is still quite limited, this is more positive than it had been in the previous review. Amongst the studies that, amongst the 2 studies that showed a positive or statistically significant effect, the important intervention components, again, are around those school curriculum changes, printed educational materials, mix of community-based strategies, audiovisual materials, as well as the provision of play equipment in the schoolyard. And this is a particularly interesting study that did nothing more than actually bring in fun play equipment for the children to play with really cue cards that went along with the equipment that gave the children ideas on what to do with that equipment. So if we just move forward now, we look at the duration of physical activity. So again, this is duration of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Here we see there were 23 studies in total. 17 of those were focused on grade school children. And 12 of those studies led to a statistically significant increase in physical activity duration. I guess I should have started off a few moments ago talking about why we did not do a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis would have allowed us to have come up with one overall effect size across these 17 studies. We did not do that for this review because of the variation across the studies. So while, as I said before, they're all school-based interventions, there are so many different things that are happening in each of those school-based interventions, I really didn't think it's appropriate to do a meta-analysis. And so here we're narratively making sense of all of the data. So when we look across these 12 studies that showed statistically significant increases in duration of MVPA, we see an increase of approximately 5 minutes to 45 minutes more per week of MVPA. And when we, those are the effect sizes, and the confidence interval, the 95% confidence interval ranges from a low and not impressive 1.4 minute, but up to approximately 90 minutes more per week of MVPA. So again, they're also a relatively wide confidence interval. But still, this is a fairly consistent finding with the original review in 2009, and just a growing body of evidence that school-based interventions can result in children spending more time being physically active during the school day. Again, what came out as consistent across the studies with respect to the intervention components, it's the changes to the school curriculum and the printed educational materials. Now, I think this is an important time to point out, however, that while I saw these consistencies in the intervention components across the studies with a statistically significant finding, what's particularly challenging in this area is that in the studies that didn't see a statistically significant finding, sometimes these interventions were also there. I'm identifying them as likely being involved or associated with these findings because they were consistently in those studies that saw the statistically significant effects. Okay, so if we now just move on to looking at television, again here there are promising results. This was similar to what we saw in 2009. 7 of 16 studies reported statistically significant effects on television viewing, and we see a range of between 5 minutes less per day to 60 minutes less per day, which actually is a fairly substantial effect size. And so this is at the effect size level here of what was provided across these different studies of a range of effects on television viewing. And again, the consistent intervention components included changes to the school curricula, printed educational materials, education sessions, as well as some community-based strategies. So if we just move on now and look at the physical health status measures, I really only highlighted for today the outcome that we saw statistically significant effect on, and that is the VO2 max, maximal oxygen consumption. And 6 studies provided data on this outcome, of which 4 found statistically significant effects on VO2 max. So an increase in VO2 max ranging from 1.6 to 3.7 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And you can see here that, again, the confidence intervals range from 0.2 to 7.2. One of the issues with this particular outcome that I need to bring to your attention is that there's a lack of consistency in how studies measure this outcome. So the various types of measures are used that all end up being labeled as VO2 max, although they might not all truly be VO2 max. But across the studies, we do seem to see that by encouraging children to spend more time involved in moderate to vigorous physical activity, we can start to see improvements in this particular outcome. Similar or consistent with the 2009 review, we saw no impact on blood pressure, body mass index, or pulse rate. In the 2009 review, we did see a statistically significant effect on cholesterol, but in this review, that effect no longer remained. I'll point out how these results differ from some other literature that is out there as it relates to body mass index. So body mass index, we had overall 32 studies that assessed body mass index. When I looked at the results and really thought about what the findings were across studies, we had a very, very small number of studies that saw any impact on body mass index. And so overall, this is where I determined that the school-based interventions evaluated in this review did not result in a change in body mass index overall. You would note that a Cochrane review published by Liz Waters, I believe in December 2011, which did do a meta-analysis, saw a statistically significant finding on body mass index in children aged 6 to 12. When they looked at children less than 6 and they looked at adolescents 13 to 18, there was no overall effect, but statistically significant impact in the childhood years. If you read through the discussion, I give some ideas on why I think that is, keeping in mind that, again, this review, my review, focused primarily on promoting physical activity. Where the review by Waters et al. Looked at this issue more comprehensively. So that would have included physical activity promotion, nutrition. So it was, and it wasn't just school-based. It included things going on at home, things going on in the community. So it was much broader. And so I think different studies. There's a little bit of overlap in studies, but there are also different studies included that I think likely results created the difference in those results. Okay, so if we just wrapping up now, so I would definitely want to leave time for questions. Overall, what are the general implications of this review for public health practice? And I've really summed it up in a couple of key points. First, that school-based interventions based on the evidence provided should be implemented, supported, and or advocated for by the public health sector as a means to increase duration of MVPA, increase the number of children engaging in MVPA, and improving VO2 max, as well as reducing television viewing. Some areas that we need to keep working on is, being more active at school didn't necessarily translate into being more active at home or outside of school. So that, to some extent, does suggest a more comprehensive type of approach. It's not just all about what goes on in the school. We need something more comprehensive. At a minimum, in terms of the intervention components, the school-based strategy needs to include printed educational materials as well as changes to the curriculum that promotes increased MVPA during the school hours, as well as supporting and educating around the importance of physical activity throughout the day. In addition, educational sessions, physical activity-specific sessions, community-based initiatives may have added benefit, but still require more evaluation to know exactly what might provide the biggest bang for the buck there. And from this review, we can also say that interventions should be implemented for a minimum of 12 weeks. There appeared to be some evidence that even at a short number, at a very minimum number of weeks, 12, we can also see some positive effects. And so I'll stop there. Before we actually perhaps do that poll question, we could now have a moment, take time now for some questions, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. And I suppose while we're starting that, if we can do the poll. So the poll question we have up there right now is, did you find the information presented today helpful? And that's a yes or a no. So we're just waiting for some questions to roll in. I'll apologize now for the review. I notice now that it's up to 228 pages long. Although much of that, if you're familiar with the Cochrane template, is lots of information on the tables, tables of all of the included studies, various information like that. But the actual text of the review itself is about 20 pages, so a lot less cumbersome than the 228 might look. So I'm not seeing any questions coming up unless I'm missing them. And so we've put up one more poll question. Sorry for the noise there. And this one is, was this information new to you? So I just hear that that perhaps there are some questions coming into the chat, but I'm just not seeing them. And what I'm seeing in response to the question of, is the information new to you? So, for some of you this was new, so that's great that this was an opportunity for you to learn some new data around school-based interventions. For those of you for which this isn't new, hopefully this is just a reaffirmation that what you're doing is substantiated by the literature. And that actually, I see that as a good sign that you're up to date with what we know to be the current understanding of the effectiveness of school-based interventions. And as I said, really between 2009 to the update in 2013, while many new studies were published, really the overall findings didn't change all that much. So I do see a question here, and the question is, did the TV measurement include video game time? And so that's a great question. So there are many measures. That were included in the study. So some of them just meant were just around watching television. Some of them lumped any screen time into an overall time for the day or the week. Some of them divided out video games, computer usage, and television. So it's really quite a mishmash of measures altogether. I see another question here that asks, how old are the grade school children? And the grade school would be considered 6 to 12. So it's grade 1 to grade 7, 8-ish. Okay, so I see here there were 24 studies that looked at physical activity rate, but you only reported on 16 of them. Okay, and so what we have here is when I report the results, and really today I focused a lot more on the grade school children. So there were 24 studies, but now I don't have the number right in front of me. 17 of them, no, a number of them only looked at grade school children, and so I reported on those, and the remainder would have looked at adolescents. And what we did see, and I failed to really highlight that enough in the presentation, is that generally across the board, none of these interventions are really having an impact with adolescents, whether it's around physical activity rates, duration of MVPA, television viewing, or all the other physical health status measures. Okay, and so another question here, can you please describe how PA outcomes were measured? So the PA outcomes, in terms of how they were measured, I'm going to take a bit of a guess at what exactly you're asking. So around physical activity rates, this was really done in two different ways. In some studies, they did that through a self-report. So asking students to comment whether, how often they were physically active, let's say in a time period, a day or a week. Other studies are using accelerometers or different ways of actually measuring. So the children wear these, and then that data is being collected on from which they can identify how long and whether or not they actually engaged in MVPA. One of the things that I did observe from 2009 to the 2013 update is more studies trying to use a more objective way to measure those outcomes. So trying to move a bit away from using the more subjective self-report to some way of actually measuring through accelerometers or another type of mechanism exactly what the children were doing. I'm just backing up here a little bit on the questions. Just bear with me for a moment. So another question was, can you give an example of curricular change? So here, what we tended to see were some changes to, in the most extreme cases, where a real complete rethinking of how the courses are arranged. It's trying to create activity within English class or science class or math class. It's changing the content within some of those other courses so that you might have educational pieces around activity levels and active behavior being implemented in not just the traditional type of health component of gym class. It's creating shorter periods that then would result in children moving more often and trying to role model that. So those are just some of the examples of some of the curricular changes that happened in some of the schools. There's another question that asks, were there any interventions that were effective for secondary school students in particular? And this is the area that I think we still have so many unanswered questions. If you look through what is now a very large body of evidence, you will find the odd study that was implemented for adolescents that may have led to an impact. But when we look at the data and the studies in their entirety, overall, we really haven't yet figured out how to increase adolescent physical activity rates and or the amount of time that they're engaged in that. So, I would encourage you to take a look through the review, and you'd be able to identify quite easily in the tables of included studies those ones that are focused on adolescents, those ones that are focused on adolescent girls. There are, sometimes they divided by gender and analyze the data that way, where we do see little snippets, but overall as a body of evidence, I would say there isn't really much to put forward as effective interventions for that age group yet. And that is consistent with the findings of others as well. So I'm just reading these as I see them. What kind of change in curriculum were in most of the studies? So I was just talking about that as well around what we were seeing. So again, it's a role modeling of more activity, more movement during the day. Again, sometimes what they built into some of the curriculum is maybe there would be a teaching component for 15 minutes followed by a active movement for 5 minutes and then back to more teaching. And that might have been implemented in science class, for example. And now I have a question here. Did you examine if there was an increased impact if in-school interventions were combined? For example, active recess, reverse lunch, more intramurals, more recreational PE classes. So we didn't sub-analyze specifically. Certainly some of the studies would have talked about, components of active recess. I do not recall seeing any of the studies specifically speaking about reverse lunch. That might be that literature hasn't reached the published single study domain. I'm just of the studies that I saw, I don't recall seeing that. While components of the studies may have had more recreational PE, so certainly talking about putting an emphasis on fun and making sure that the activity meets the developmental levels of the different kids, having a specialist in physical education leading the PE classes, those types of things, there does seem to be some support that those are important, although I'd say we don't quite know that definitively. That looks promising in terms of
Hello, Maureen. I'm just going to interject here. I believe Helen may have a question. She's got her hand up. Helen, if you could place your question into the chat room at the bottom, we will take it in order. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. I hadn't noticed that. Sorry, I see so much written in the chat. I've just been focusing there. So I see an additional question here is, was there a greater impact if there was a combination of in-school? Oh, sorry. I've just read that one. Sorry. Or is it it's very similar. Okay. This is very challenging. So I guess the one comment I would make is, those interventions that had many, many, many components didn't necessarily end up being more effective than interventions only made up of one or two components. And it's interesting because we've seen some similar results emerge out of the knowledge translation literature from a review that Jeremy Grimshaw and others did in the last few years that said, a knowledge translation strategy with many, many things all going on at the same time doesn't necessarily lead to a greater effect than just having one or two. So I certainly found that here, that I don't think we can necessarily say by having all of these or more is better. I see walking to school, and I guess I would just point out here that if that existed in the studies, it wouldn't have been a main focus of the intervention because it was primarily what was going on in the school, although there could have been some components of things that could go on in the home or things that were going on in the community. It was primarily focused on what happened in the school setting. So I'm just going down a little bit. Can you provide an example of an intervention that involved a community-based strategy? And what comes to mind here is where the intervention involved getting community partners involved in promoting physical activity. So whether that is organizations that had I don't really want to say sports, but activity types of strategies they could make available. So really just trying to promote in these communities an awareness of the importance of being physically active, getting families out, doing things. Those were some of the types of interventions that were a part of the school-based strategy. Okay, so just a couple of other questions I see here. When changes to the curriculum is mentioned, does that mean at the provincial level or at each individual school? That's a fantastic question. And I mean, keeping in mind that in most instances, what is currently in the literature, these were all randomized controlled trials, and in most instances I would say this is either happening at an individual school or amongst schools in a city. So these very much look like funded research projects, fairly well-funded research projects, I should also add, that then resulted in schools being invited to participate, and then some are randomized to receive the intervention and others weren't. So no, this would not, it did not appear to me that any of these studies were implementing a provincial standard or expectation for example, a minimum amount of MVPA. So I've talked about the importance of curriculum changes. Can you define this more? And so again, you know, what's difficult if it seems like I'm wavering, it's because there was just so much variability across these studies in terms of what was actually done with the curriculum. But basically, it's making changes to the school and what happens during the school day that results in children being more active at that MVPA level throughout the day. It means, it might have meant, for example, in what are considered the traditional PE class, that there's much more time spent in the PE class at an MVPA level. So some of the things that we know from the background reading that all of the studies talk about is that, you know, all children in school have there's an expectation that they are part of, they experience physical education classes, but there's a fair amount of evidence that suggests kids aren't all that active during that time that they're in that PE class. And so this would have involved changes to the PE curriculum that would have children being involved in activities that would sustain MVPA for longer periods of time. But then also, as I said, it's actually changing the rest of the curriculum so that there's this allows for more activity to be interspersed throughout the day, just not at particular short bursts of time during one or two times of the day. Okay, so another question there just about the curriculum. I think I've tried to address that. Why did I not look at fitness measured other ways besides VO2 max? So yes, yeah, you're right. There is an extremely long list of outcomes that we could have reported on as it relates to fitness measures as well as other physical status measures like skin fold thickness, things like that. So there's many ways. One of the things to keep in mind is if it's only included in one or two studies, a particular measure, even though we have 44 studies, then we only have one or two that actually report on a particular type of measure. It becomes difficult in terms of what we can really say about that. So we really tried to identify what seemed to be some key measures, knowing that to include every single measure in there also would just make a review that much more complex, that much longer to read. And so we tried to focus on when we first did the original review, which was actually even before 2009. It only became a Cochrane review in 2009. That at that time, these were some of the key outcomes that decision makers in public health in Ontario were interested in knowing about. So did the studies on TV use report or measure the TV usage more objectively? And so that's, again, a really good question. And what we have here across the studies is a combination of some studies using self-report, both by the child and the parent. And then we have some studies that actually had a device that was placed on the TV that could that then measured actually the amount of time that the TV was on. I don't recall that being applied to other forms of screens, so video games or computer use. But for the TVs, in some instances, they did have a device that would measure that. And then I see another question here. Did some interventions include daily school-based physical activity? And again, I think I was trying to address that a bit earlier around, is this like an evaluation of, for example, a provincial standard? And I would say for the most part of the studies that I saw, which would now be current to, let's see, the search was probably completed at the end of 2000 or early 2012. So it might be that some of this additional evidence is now being published since then, that very much likely would be included in the next review. So I see that we're actually at 2:05, Eileen. I'm not sure if you want me to keep going because there's more questions, or
certainly,
maybe I'll just let you
because we do have the room till 2:30, and I believe it was advertised till 2:30. So if there are more questions, please feel free.
Great. Okay, thanks, Eileen. So I'll keep going. So I have a question here that asks, have you stratified your results according to measurement method? If so, does this make any difference to the results? So I mean, these are really excellent questions. So nice to see these questions coming in today. Yes, we did look at that. So that is very important, although stratified only really in two ways. Was it something that we would consider to be objective, for example, an accelerometer or some other type of a similar measurement like that, or was it self-report, which would be considered less objective? So throughout the discussion and the results of the review, you would see that I've referred to whether or not we see differences in the results, whether a more objective means was used. And generally what I would say, while there might be a few differences here and there, generally the objective measures were consistent with what we were finding or what was being reported in the more subjective measures. So there seemed to be consistency there across the findings of using those two different types of measures. Printed materials were provided to children, their parents, or educators. So very good question again. So this is all three. So in many of the studies, teachers received, or educators received, usually materials, training materials. They may have attended training sessions on how to deliver the interventions. So there were materials for the educators. Many times the children were receiving printed educational materials, and sometimes then in addition there would have been special materials appropriate for the parents. Not all of the studies included parents and included a home component, but some of them did. When I reflect back on the parental component, in this body of literature amongst these 44 studies, I would, it really appears that the evidence isn't clear one way or the other, that parent involvement really was key to intervention success or into improvement in the outcomes for the children. Sometimes it was associated, and many times it didn't appear, or just overall the intervention didn't appear to have an impact. So in answering this question, yes, there was material sent for all of these 3 different groups. We don't know that it's always effective in terms of the parental component. Next question is, have you compared the effectiveness of different school-based interventions? What type of school intervention is the most effective? I think I'd need to know a little bit more information, and particularly what you're asking for here specifically. But generally, this is a really tough question to answer. And I think it's not possible to answer the question in this way because, as I've said, no 2 school-based interventions were exactly the same. Some reviewers might question then why I put them all together, and that's a valid question. However, I think this is a body of knowledge for which there's a great deal of interest, and so putting in one place and trying to make sense of all of the different types of intervention components that fall under school-based interventions, I think is a useful exercise. But because the interventions were so different from study to study to study, we can't say one type was more effective than another. And I think the farthest that we can go and still be not stepping outside of the bounds of what the evidence shows us is that in every study that showed a statistically significant effect, there were changes to the curriculum and there were printed educational materials. Those are 2 constants across all of the interventions. And so that's why I focused on, there seems to be something really important there. And then there are some additional strategies that were there sometimes and not there all of the time when a positive effect was observed. And so that's why I'm saying I think there's likely promise with those additional ones, like specific PE classes, educational sessions, and a few of those community-based activities as well. In terms of the example of printed educational materials, so these would have been easy to read materials that children would get and could could read, so they're at an easy reading level, interactive, those types of things. They could take them home. They could put them up in their locker. They're one of the challenges of systematic reviews, of course, is you can only describe what you see in the individual studies, and I can't really tell you a lot more about what those printed educational materials look like other than what I've already said. So another question is, can you speak to the impact of multi-component programs versus single interventions? And again, this is an important question, and I wouldn't say that we have really definitive answers. As I've said, more wasn't always better. Longer wasn't always better. We have the one example which really comes from Northern European country where just the provision of additional sports play equipment with lots of ideas on how to use that equipment that was focused around fun. It did result in children spending more time being engaged in MVPA. So that's an example of how a single intervention really led to some significant changes. And then in other instances where it was something much more comprehensive that led to those changes. So, I think what's really important to do would be in the studies, the table of included studies that gives you details on the settings and the types of interventions and some demographic information, that sort of thing. It's really kind of looking at, you know, do some of these seem to coincide well with, you know, what our setting is, and thinking about what might be most applicable. Yeah, so another question is around, were there any interventions that were effective for secondary school students in particular? I mean, the one area, and this was primarily American literature, where I saw this, was when there are a number of studies that have been conducted in the U.S. in multiple cities that look at interventions for adolescent girls that is structured around dance, non-competitive type of activities. And, you know, there does appear to be some effects there for that population. The challenge was just that we don't see that, those results didn't seem to be consistently reflected across the studies in this review that focused on adolescents. So there are some snippets there, and definitely, again, if you were to look at the review more closely, you'd be able to see those. But I really can't identify particular interventions that seem to be effective across the adolescent population. Okay, I think I've seen that question before. So one question I see here is, what do you think is the largest contributing factor to the lack of change in BMI in these studies? Very, very good question, and I think I would think about this as well in relation to the different findings that Liz Waters found in her review and meta-analysis, where BMI was a main primary outcome. This is a little bit conjecture on my part, but if I have to, I guess, try to guess at what I think happened here is, you know, it strikes me that BMI is something that needs a more holistic approach. That if we're primarily interested in changing BMI, then it needs to be more than physical activity that's targeted, right? And so this review, I guess some could question, well, then why do a review just looking at physical activity? But I think if BMI is the primary outcome of interest, then a much more comprehensive approach that looks at both nutrition, healthy eating, and being more physically active and less inactive, all of those things together may be leading to changes in BMI. And when you look at the results of Liz Waters' review, particularly amongst children 6 to 12, do we end up seeing those types of findings that that lead to that. So it could be that in this case, changing, even encouraging children to spend more time in being physically active isn't necessarily enough of a change to have a significant impact on BMI. That could be one way to think about those results, and you need something more comprehensive. So the next question I see is, did studies measure the association between TV viewing and physical activity? That's a good question, and not one that I feel I can answer at this moment. Although, you know, if it wasn't something that was looked at, for example, even in a regression analysis, it likely is something to think about for the future. So if TV viewing is going down, what are children doing if they're not watching TV? Are they then being more active? One of the things that I do know, although it wasn't an outcome that we specifically pulled out in this update, is are children more active outside of school? And there isn't necessarily a good correlation that being more active at school means you're more active outside of school. And it's partly why in the discussion of the review as well, I am suggesting something more comprehensive is likely needed. So it's not just all about getting kids to be more active during the school day, but what else can we do to keep that going outside of the school day? Another question is, do you also find studies reporting an impact of PA on any developmental measures? I can't comment on that because we did not pull that out. I mean, it is an important issue. It's one of those challenges, particularly in this field and area where there are so many outcomes that we could look at. The more outcomes you pull out, the more complicated the review becomes and long, which then you start to worry, are you going to be able to really provide enough good answers that'll be useful to decision makers? I was recently asked if we had pulled out any data on physical activity and mental health types of outcomes and wellness outcomes, of which we also did not, as well as cognitive function outcomes, so how well are children doing at school. So there's many ways in which we could slice the review and different outcomes we could look at. We didn't do that. It doesn't mean that someone couldn't look at the same series of studies and see if that evidence is in there. Some of them would have it, many of them likely don't. There's likely a whole other body of evidence that one would need to access to get those different types of outcomes. Another question, can you clarify whether there was any impact of the interventions on kids' physical activity levels outside of the school day? And again, while this wasn't an outcome we specifically commented on, although an important one, my recollection from looking at all of these studies is that there wasn't necessarily an increase outside of the school time. So is there a common definition of physical activity among the studies? So you're raising a very good point here in that generally in this field, the defining of outcomes and their measurement is pretty messy. So the studies use lots of different ways of defining that. In this case, the common denominator was defined as moderate to vigorous physical activity. I might see if I can get someone to actually look up in the background part of the review if that was specifically defined. So I will come back to that I just have someone looking that up for me. Question here is, do you have any insights as to why there was no impact on blood pressure, cholesterol, and other health status measures? So I guess I have a few hypotheses. They may not all be correct, and some of you may actually know better than I what some answers to that question would be. But first we have to think about whether or not some of these outcomes are even the right outcomes to be measuring. So if the majority of students in this age group, regardless of weight, have blood pressure within the normal range, then depending on how it's being measured, would we expect to see any difference? So those might be some of the hypotheses, is that one, is there a direct correlation among children between physical activity levels and some of these health status measures? The second idea or hypothesis that I have is that perhaps it still isn't enough, that the increases, while statistically significant in some of these studies, isn't enough to actually have a significant impact on the physical health status measures. If you recall, on the duration of MVPA, in some of those studies, the amount of time was very small, like 1.4 minutes, I believe, and an effect size of 5. And so while at the high end of the confidence interval, 60 minutes more of MVPA a day you might think would have an impact on some of these outcomes, at the lower end, we may not, that just might not be enough to have an impact. And with respect to pulse rate, that again I think would apply there in terms of how much sustained MVPA should children have or be exposed to in a day to actually see a change in pulse rate. So I'm just coming back, where is it? I'm just coming back to looking at the how MVPA was designed, or the physical activity measure, or how PA was measured. Sorry, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that one today, but certainly if that's an ongoing question, if you'd like to contact me following the webinar, I'd be happy to look into that further. So the question is common definition of physical activity.
Thank you very much, Maureen. A lot of questions coming through there. And I'd like to thank you very much for presenting today on school-based physical activity. Let's all give Maureen a round of applause now. Thank you very much. Now, your feedback is valuable. And Catherine will be placing a link into the chat room that you can connect to for the evaluation, which should take approximately 5 minutes. And if you would like to contact Health Evidence, here is their information. And don't forget, we will be, if you have registered with us and with your full name, we will be sending a copy, a PDF of these slides to you following the presentation. And finally, Maureen, I'll now give you a minute to extend this invitation to everyone here.
Great, thanks, Eileen. So this is a funded project where we are doing some evaluation of different ways in which we are conducting the webinars. So you'll see here an invitation to complete a pilot study questionnaire. It is fairly short, so it won't take probably not more than 10 minutes, I would think, to complete. And we would be very appreciative if you could participate in this evaluation. And so it's really trying to look at different mechanisms in the delivery of webinars, whether or not you do it like today and there's a group of people that don't know each other that are on the call, versus doing something where perhaps there might be 20 or 30 of you in your own organization that are all looking at it at the same time. So there are just some different types of mechanisms that we're trying to explore, and would be very grateful if you could fill in that questionnaire for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much,
Eileen. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. We hope that it's been a valuable time spent together, and you had the information. And as I had mentioned at the very beginning of the session, this session has been recorded and will appear on the Canadian Cochrane Centre Training and Events website under Website Archives. Now that will be perhaps in a while. It may take 2 weeks to turn this into a YouTube, or it may take perhaps even a month or a month and a half. But it will be there for your viewing if you'd like to review it again. So again, thank you very much and have a good day.